Okay, Sputnik, sweetheart. Okay, and it was only a matter of time until I got to a Murakami book. Of course, it would be the second book because just coming off of Kanazgard, I had to go back and read Murakami. If you read or listened to my Kanazgard review of The Morning Star, you know that I think the two have a lot in common, and then I did my thing on complexity and depth. So, of course, I've said the word Murakami so many times I had to go back. He's my boy, my favorite author. And Sputnik Sweetheart is a fantastic Murakami book insofar as it's very short and it has all the things that I absolutely love about Murakami. So, slight change to the format. I'm going to do a brief plot summary, then get into the... Well, I already answered why I chose this book, but I'll do the why I chose this book, the recommendation, and then get into the pros, cons, give you another chance to stop if that's where you're good, and then get into spoilers in a thematic discussion. So, Sputnik Sweetheart. The main character, there's a protagonist, it's an I novel, which means that his name isn't super important. In fact, all we ever get is that it's K, which I believe it's not the first character by Murakami to be named K. I'm not 100% certain, but I'm pretty sure it's a reference to Kafka's work, because both The Castle and The Trial featured a protagonist named K. So it could be a reference to that. I don't know. I thought Kafka on the Shore was a reference to Kafka, but it's also, I think, Bulgarian. I don't know. For Crow, which may well have been an alias of Franz Kafka, and I'm sounding like a complete moron right now. Either way, the main character, his name is K. He is, like most Murakami protagonists, youngish, I'd say mid to late 20s, so a bit younger for Murakami protagonists. You know, middle class, well-read, reads a lot, fairly isolated, and he has really only one friend in the world that he connects with, and her name is Sumire, and she is a very wild person in the sort of literary sense of she cares about nothing except writing and reading, to the point where she dropped out of college to write, and she lives on a shoestring budget that she gets from her parents, buys pretty much nothing but books, and just writes up a storm, but in the end never really feels a whole, like her writing is really amounting to anything, despite feeling like she has so much to say and having this passion for writing. When she does write, the results are middling. So, when she is at a wedding, she happens to run into this person named Mew. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm not 100%. It's either Mew or Mew. She is a Korean woman who was born and raised in Japan and views herself as very Japanese. And she and Sumire really strike it off. She's a bit older and very successful, very wealthy. And she asks Sumire to come work with Mew, or with her, and Sumire instantly falls in love with Mew. And because she's working with Mew as a private assistant, as Mew does her job, they're very close together. And at one point, they end up going on a trip to Italy. This evolves, and then they end up on a Greek island. And while they're on this Greek island, Sumire goes missing. And that's kind of the first half of the book. And then the rest of the book deals with that and the consequences of that. So, how did I come to this book? Like I said, after Kanazgard and all this talk about Murakami, I absolutely wanted to go back and reread a Murakami book. And Sputnik Sweetheart is my favorite of Murakami's shorter novels. And one of my favorites among his works in general. Anytime I need a quick dose of Murakami, this is the book I go to, because it has everything I love about Murakami, the ambiguity, the sort of fractal storytelling, where there's so many ways to interpret it, and every time I read it, I've read this book a dozen times, and every time I come away with a slightly different take, a slightly different understanding of the characters and the events. So, in terms of would I recommend it? Absolutely. Although, if it's your first Murakami work, I would still suggest starting with either Wind Up Bird, Kafka on the Shore, or Norwegian Wood. I think those are better insofar as they're slightly longer. They give you slightly more character to latch on to. But if you really just don't want to dedicate your time to a longer novel and you just want a quick idea of what Murakami is, then yes, read Sputnik Sweetheart. It's great. Like I said, I think it's the best. It's my personal favorite of his short novels, and the one that I think best encapsulates the style that he's known for. And on top of that, if you're a Murakami fan or have read some of his other books and enjoyed them, and you haven't checked out Sputnik Sweetheart, then absolutely do so. If you don't like Murakami, I can't imagine this being the one to change your mind, but perhaps the shorter length could do it. But it depends on why you didn't like Murakami, and I can't really answer that for you. So basically, I mean, yes, strong recommendation, great book. To get into the pros and the cons, which I feel like I already addressed. The pros: wildly interpretive story. Like with all Murakami books, it's got that Lynchian angle of ambiguity that allows for so many interpretations, while at the same time providing a kind of beginning, middle, end that you can follow and still get an enjoyable story out of it, even if you're not able to quite... I shouldn't say not able to, because that sounds... Even if you don't necessarily feel the need to, or don't feel inclined towards trying to get that sort of deeper meaning or parsing that deeper meaning out of it. In terms of cons, or I kind of want to go pro-con on this one. So in terms of a con, like I said, it's shorter, so the characters aren't as developed as you would get in like a Kafka on the Shore or Wind Up Bird Chronicle or Killing Commendatore. So in that sense, again, the characters are more caricatures, but that could be applied to a lot of Murakami's work. You know, the depth is kind of in how literally you choose to interpret what they're saying, which I think is brilliant and allows for a lot of interpretation, but I can see how if you want a little bit more to grab onto, you might not get it here. Fair enough. Going back to prose, I think it tells a great story in a very short amount of time. Like, by keeping the cast of characters really small, really tight, it effectively gives each one just enough screen time to accomplish what they do. It's got that perfect iceberg effect where they're not on the screen for very long, but you can just see the depth beneath. You can feel it, and the more you think about it, the more layers you constantly sort of peel back to these characters. And I think, personally, the mystery of what happened to Sumire is very compelling. The writing is so fantastic. Murakami's writing always sticks with me, and Sputnik Sweetheart is really during what I would consider like peak Murakami. The sort of Wind Up Bird Chronicle, Kafka on the Shore, Norwegian Wood, Sputnik Sweetheart is all kind of in peak Murakami area. I personally still love Killing Commendatore, and even The City and Its Uncertain Walls I enjoyed a lot. But for anybody, you know, I can see how there was a slight shift in Murakami's writing, and in that sense, Sputnik Sweetheart still peak Murakami, peak sort of dreamy atmosphere, and again, his shorter sentences, but really poignant and existential, that sort of stab at the heart of the sort of crises that really face people and face us as individuals in sort of really primarily like hyper-capitalistic societies, I think, are where you're going to see it most. And how do I say this? In a way, it's that... It is for somebody, like for an author who has literally put metaphors into his work as characters, like anthropomorphize, you know what I mean, anthropomorphize characters into, or anthropomorphize metaphors and ideas into characters. His metaphors are brilliant in the sense that they accomplish exactly what a metaphor should do, which is grabbing this broader abstract concept and really filtering it down into a single comparison. So when you're talking about loneliness and you're comparing it to a satellite orbiting the Earth, it's such a beautiful metaphor because, again, it's so simple, and yet it drives or contains within this sort of simplicity, like a shell, all of the feelings that you would associate with being alone in a satellite drifting through the emptiness of space. So again, just a very, very short number of words, and yet within those words contains so much emotion. And I have, as of yet, to find a writer that really resonates with me and accomplishes that in the same way that Murakami does. So again, like, cons, maybe you won't like some of the characters, you know, if you look for something a bit more developed, and maybe you won't like the resolution if you're looking for something like just really hard beginning, middle, end. I don't want to say I don't want to think about it, but to not have that sort of metaphorical quality to it, like it will make sense, but only so literally. So I can see kind of people, if you're the type of person who gets to the end of a movie like Annihilation and Googles what happened at the end of Annihilation because you want to know about the space alien aspect, then maybe it's not for you, but you know, that shouldn't stop you from trying it, because who knows, it could be the thing that it really changes your mind and makes you think more deeply. Because I mean, even the fact that you're Googling an answer shows a willingness to engage with the work. And I think that's, you know, sort of the big thing is, are you willing to try and engage with it seriously and give it a shot. So moving on into themes now. So this is sort of going into full spoiler territory. If I have convinced you to read it, fantastic, click off. If you don't care, getting into it. So the biggest theme of Sputnik Sweetheart, undeniably, is loneliness. The back of the book even calls it a profound meditation on human longing. And I already mentioned there's the metaphor of Sputnik floating into space, and you have the sort of final speech between Kay and the kid, Carrot, as he's known by, where he talks about how lonely he is and how he never sort of realized it. And all the characters are lonely in some way. You know, Sumire doesn't have anybody who can really connect with or understand with her. Her stepmother loves her but doesn't quite get her. She's always been missing really affection from her family. And her father is a very handsome person. Lots of people like him, but he's not the most emotionally available. Her mother died when she was young, and she feels like she really needs something from her mother, as demonstrated in her dreams, but her father isn't able to give her that. And so she's left with this sort of void in her existence, in her heart. And you could definitely take an angle of it where Mew is in some ways a surrogate mother, but the point is that, and you have the main character who also has troubles with his family. He mentions that his dog died and his parents wouldn't get another one because they're noisy and dirty. He mentions that his family never understood him, and he never understood them. So again, like, just lonely people who really only have each other in terms of somebody that they're open and honest with. And for the main character, of course, this drives him nuts because he likes Sumire as a woman, but as we later discover, Sumire is a lesbian and is just not attracted to the main character at all. Which doesn't mean that their relationship isn't important, and as she says, multiple times, you're my number one friend. And I don't think... maybe this is just important to me, but I think Murakami isn't underselling their relationship because it's not a romantic one. And I think part of the protagonist's sort of realization in the end is that as much as he wanted it to be a romantic relationship, just the relationship itself was so valuable and so meaningful that now that it's gone, he's utterly lost and adrift. And then you have Mew herself, who was most likely, like, my interpretation is absolutely that she was raped, and as a consequence of that rape, her body, or rather her personality, her life was split into two, and she had to give up not she had to give up, but she wasn't able to connect with that side of her that was able to produce music, and had to sort of reinvent herself and become another person, but at the same time, a person who can't be touched, a person who can have a cordial relationship and even a positive relationship with somebody like Sumire, or somebody like her husband, whom she describes having a very cordial, cordial makes it sound, a very friendly relationship with. Like they get along well, they're partners. She mentioned she couldn't imagine being with anybody else, and being not in a necessarily sexual connotation. So just somebody who is doing the best, who is continuing forward with their life, which kind of brings me to the interpretive aspect. This is kind of the first time I've recorded something so suddenly after reading it, and for something that I've read so many times and come away with so many times, mostly what I'm going to do here is share my interpretation of the book reading it this time. This, there's every possibility that the next time I read the book, I'll come away with it totally differently. But again, in keeping with the Sumire, or rather Miu, was raped on the Ferris wheel and created this story of seeing herself from the outside in order to sort of not relive, but fill in that spot in her mind. I also am of the opinion this time that Sumire did kill herself. The protagonist insists that she didn't. Miu insists that she didn't at first, but they say that the first stage is denial. And I absolutely think that the other side that Murakami talks about Sumire going to is sort of the realm of death. He talks about it in terms of the side where Miu's other half is, the side where Sumire's mother is, the side where and ultimately the side where Sumire herself goes. And it's just a tragic way to look at it, but I think that despite the multiple insistences that it's not that, that's what happened. And that's why he talks about when he comes back on the ferry back, and he spends the night in Athens, and he's looking up at the stars, and he talks about not knowing that he will wake up tomorrow a different person than he was today. I think that that's a kind of acceptance from him of the fact that Sumire is gone, and he will absolutely never see her again, at least not in the quote-unquote real world, and this to be death. And when Sumire's emails, I don't want to gloss over this. It's kind of hard to keep track of one thought, because there's just, for a book where loneliness is the core theme, there's so many things going on. Sumire's own emotional trouble is very heart-wrenching, because when she comes to Miu, she's in a fetal state. She describes a dream in document 1 that she has of climbing a tower. She hears her mother calling for her. She climbs to a tower, and she sees her mother being sucked through a hole. Her mother is telling her something very important, and her mother is sucked through the hole. And then she finds herself standing at the top of a tower with lots of paper planes floating around her. And I believe that this is meant to be kind of, I personally interpret it as, she wasn't able to hear what she needed from her mother, and now she is standing alone at the top of a tower, and I believe in the end she ends up falling kind of through oblivion. But she's standing at the top of the tower alone, trying to call out, but nobody's able to call out. Nobody is able to give her the emotional sort of bond that she needs in order to survive and get that kind of validation. I don't know if I want to say validation, but really just that emotional support. And at the same time, you have Kay, who is also isolated. Like I said, he's got the metaphor of the lonely Sputnik, and just how people are so separate in their lives. So again, just that recurring theme of loneliness and how the two look at it. But then, again, in the first document, the conclusion that Sumire comes to is that she has to try with Mew. She can't keep her feelings bottled up inside, and she knows that it's a big risk to talk to Mew like this. But like she says, blood has to be spilt. This is sort of the primary recurring metaphor that they talk about is blood has to be spilt in order for the magic of the gates to work. Tying into the Chinese thing, but basically, like the reason that Sumire's writing wasn't good enough, the reason she could never quite write anything or produce anything, was that she hadn't had that kind of sacrifice yet, that kind of big thing to really make the magic work. So this is her finally taking the risk to do that. And she talks in her dream about how she'd wake up biting her pillow. And when Mew describes finding Sumire, she describes finding her in a fetal position with her teeth clenched around a towel. And I feel like this is meant to suggest that Sumire had that dream, and also the fetal position, her comatose nature. She also mentions that this happens to her from time to time. But the comatose nature, the stripping her down, wiping her down, it's a very childlike state. It's almost like a rebirth state of, like, literally fetus position. She is coming to Mew in her most vulnerable state, and Mew rejects her ultimately. And it's not because Mew doesn't like her, it's because Mew isn't able to provide for her what she needs. And I don't think that it's Mew's fault in any way, shape, or form, beyond even just the fact that Mew herself is, I don't want to say damaged, but certainly bearing scars and has that split within her. Even if she didn't, that wouldn't necessarily mean that she is obligated to return Sumire's affections. Like, at the end of the day, she's just not able to provide that. And unfortunately for Sumire, I believe this time going through, it winds up leaving her, quotes, wanting to go find the Mew on the other side, which, according to the protagonist later, is also where her mother is, which is why I just, as much as he says that it's not reeking of death or coated with death, it's absolutely coated with death, is my take this time. So now we switch over to Kei, because of course Sumire comes back in the end, or so it seems. But I think the big thing with Kei is him sort of realizing not just how lonely he is, but how his isolation is impacting the people around him, especially as a teacher with children. Because I've always found the incident with Carrot, it undeniably sticks out like a sore thumb from the rest of the story, because it's mostly introducing characters who haven't been discussed to this point and haven't really, or have just been brought up briefly, and now all of a sudden the focus is on them. It really interrupts the relationships between Kei and Sumire and Mew, who have been definitely the trifecta up to this point. And for 20 pages, you're kind of ripped away to something completely different. But I think that it's an extremely important part of the story in terms of understanding how Kei is processing his life now that the one thing that he really connected with, his only friend in the world, is gone. And with Carrot, he kind of sees, he apologizes to the security guard, saying, you know, I had this student for a year and a half, and ultimately I failed to notice that there was anything wrong with his behavior. And later on, he even breaks up with the mother because undeniably he feels that there's some connection there between that and Carrot. And he opens up to Carrot and tells him of what happens with Mew. and lets the key sort of fall in the river and is able to, in a way, sort of move forward. But he also recognizes that he can't continue to be this isolated person just looking out for himself. Although you know, he does say at the end that as much as he argues that it would be best for everyone, and personally I truly do think it is best for everyone, he says that it's what he needs for himself. And maybe that's true, but sometimes what you need for yourself does end up being what's best for everyone. So I think he's being a bit too hard on himself in that sense. But moving on, there's kind of two ways I can take the sort of reappearance of Sumire at the end. And the first is, and this is, by the way, this is in the context of this reading where she did commit suicide. I think that there's a thing in there about, and the reason that this incident with Kara is so important, about how even though we only meet each other at brief times and then we go separate ways, like satellites coming briefly into contact before their orbit parts, is that we still leave a mark on each other. And even if we may not still be together, that mark stays. And I find it interesting that he repeatedly talks about reliving the sort of memories in Greece, because he mentions, like, there's not a place that I can go back to, like, in the real world and meet with Sumire, but we can still meet in dreams and in memories. And he is so focused on those memories and so focused on that connection that in the end he makes the statement, "I'm ready, I can go anywhere." Right you are, which is completely Sumire's syntax. It's her way of speaking. It's how she speaks in the first document. So it could be a way of him, like, my sort of optimistic take is it's his way of grafting or appreciating, recognizing that Sumire may be gone from the real world, but a part of her continues to live on in him and through their shared experiences together. That's sort of my optimistic take. A more pessimistic view is, unfortunately, that he likewise ended up surrendering to his depression and ending his own life. I think specifically via the final lines, "I spread my fingers apart and stare at the palms of both hands, looking for bloodstains. There aren't any. No scent of blood, no stiffness. The blood must have already, in its own silent way, seeped inside." Which, again, Sumire, it talks in her final email about slitting the throat of a dog and spilling blood. I believe that it means being a certain kind of vulnerability, but it could also be coded for ultimately taking the risk and killing yourself, which it's possible to take it that way. I'm kind of mixed, and this is kind of the joy of Sputnik Sweetheart, is it's so open to interpretation. Like I said, there's a fractal. It's like a fractal. When I started reading the book, I thought that there might be some connection with greatness, because Sumire wants to be a great writer, and Mew was on track to be a great pianist, and his girlfriend mentioned something about how Kay could potentially be a great teacher someday. But as I went through the book, I found that particular reading wasn't holding water after about the halfway point. In fact, Sumire in her writing kind of falls off the wayside a bit until it, comes back again. But by that point, it's just that reading didn't work. But this particular reading, I'm feeling fairly comfortable with. I've read it in other ways too in the past. It is just a question of really how literally do you take certain, what characters are saying, and how do you choose to interpret the coding? Do you take the spilling blood as a sort of, it's a sacrifice of some sort, but what sacrifice is it? Is it a sacrifice of your own life? Is it a sacrifice of vulnerability? Is it something else? So really, it's a type of book that it's so short, and you can reread it so many times. And I have no doubt that I'll reread it again next time with a different approach and get something new out of it. And that's like the brilliance of Murakami's writing, and why he is my favorite author, why I enjoy directors like David Lynch. It's just that ambiguous work that I'm just repeating myself at this point, which is the sign that I need to stop. So Sputnik Sweetheart, fantastic book. Glad I got a chance to talk to about Murakami, get it out of the way, and next time it'll be moving on to something else.